Corin Ashworth had smuggled contraband past 3 different military blockades, negotiated with pirates who considered murder a hobby, and once talked his way out of an airlock at gunpoint using nothing but charm and a questionable recipe for synthetic alcohol. None of that had prepared him for walking through the gates of Nethys Prime while holding the hand of a 7-year-old girl who might or might not be galactic royalty. "Are you sure this is the right place?" he asked for the 3rd time, looking up at crystalline spires that seemed to grow from living light rather than conventional construction materials. The entire city hummed with bioluminescent energy, creating patterns of blue and silver that shifted like aurora across every surface. Liva squeezed his hand tighter, her own luminescent skin brightening with excitement. "The Light City," she said in the soft voice that had barely risen above a whisper during their 3-week journey. "Home. Safe place." Corin hoped she was right, because turning back was no longer an option. The moment their transport had entered Netherian space, it had been surrounded by escort fighters whose weapon systems could have vaporized his modest cargo hauler without breaking formation. The fact that they'd been guided to the capital rather than blown out of space suggested that someone very important wanted to see them. Which could be either very good news or very bad news, depending on who that someone was. "Sir," the escort commander's voice crackled through his ship's communication system, "you will dock at Terminal 7 and submit to immediate inspection. Any deviation from prescribed approach vectors will be considered a hostile act." "Understood," Corin replied, though he was beginning to question the wisdom of following the cryptic directions of a child he'd found in a refugee camp. Proceeding to Terminal 7 for inspection. The docking process involved more security scans than Corin had encountered in most military installations. His cargo hauler was examined by teams of technicians whose equipment looked advanced enough to detect individual molecules, while he and Liva were subjected to biological scans, psychological evaluations, and what appeared to be some kind of genetic analysis. "Purpose of visit?" asked the security chief, an Netherian male whose luminescent skin patterns indicated high military rank and extremely low tolerance for nonsense. "Humanitarian mission," Corin said, which was technically true even if it sounded absurd in the context of breaching one of the most secure star systems in the galaxy. "I'm returning a lost child to her family." The security chief looked at Liva, who was studying the crystalline architecture with the kind of recognition that suggested deep familiarity. "Child, what is your name?" "Liva," she said, then added something in musical Netherian that made every guard in the docking bay freeze. "What did she say?" Corin asked, noting the sudden tension in the security team's posture. "She said," the security chief replied, his voice carefully controlled, "that she is Princess Liva Velthyss, daughter of Queen Seraphina, and she would like to see her mother now." Corin felt the universe tilt sideways as he processed this information. "Princess." "The Princess Liva died 7 years ago," the security chief said, though his eyes never left the child's face. "Killed in a terrorist attack on a royal transport. There were no survivors." "I'm not dead," Liva said simply, her luminescent skin pulsing with what Corin had learned was her version of indignation. "I got lost. But I found my way home." The security protocols that followed were unlike anything Corin had experienced. Instead of the detention he'd expected, they were escorted through the city by a full honor guard, their route lined with Netherians whose luminescent patterns showed everything from curiosity to disbelief to hope. Word of their arrival had spread through the capital with the speed of light, and Corin found himself at the center of a crowd that seemed to be holding its collective breath. "This is really happening," he muttered, watching as palace guards in ceremonial armor formed protective formations around their transport. "I'm actually bringing a lost princess home to an alien queen who probably has the power to vaporize entire star systems." "Mother doesn't vaporize people," Liva said with the matter-of-fact tone that children use to discuss obvious facts. "She puts them in the correction chambers. Much more efficient." "That's reassuring," Corin said, though he was beginning to understand that his simple good deed had consequences that extended far beyond returning a lost child to her family. The palace itself defied every architectural principle Corin understood. Walls flowed like frozen waterfalls, corridors branched and merged according to some organic logic, and the entire structure seemed to pulse with the same bioluminescent energy that powered the city. They were led through increasingly elaborate checkpoints, each one requiring higher security clearance and more sophisticated identification protocols. "Sir," one of the guards said as they approached what appeared to be the final security barrier, "Her Majesty has been informed of your arrival. She will receive you in the throne chamber immediately." "Immediately?" Corrin asked, suddenly aware that he was wearing the same travel-stained clothes he'd been living in for 3 weeks. "Shouldn't I clean up first? Learn some protocol? Figure out how to address galactic royalty without causing an intergalactic incident?" "Sir," the guard replied with what might have been sympathy, "when the Queen of Nethys Prime wants to see someone immediately, protocol becomes irrelevant." The final doors opened to reveal a chamber that took Corrin's breath away. The throne room was carved from a single enormous crystal that caught and amplified light from sources he couldn't identify, creating an environment that felt more like standing inside a living star than any conventional architectural space. Nobles in flowing robes lined the walls, their luminescent skin patterns creating a constantly shifting display of colors that spoke a visual language Corrin couldn't read. And on the crystalline throne at the center of it all sat Queen Seraphina Velthys. Corrin had seen images of the Netherian queen in diplomatic briefings, but no recording could have prepared him for her physical presence. She was tall even by Netherian standards, her luminescent skin showing the silver and blue patterns that indicated royal bloodline, and her bearing suggested someone accustomed to absolute authority. Her face was beautiful in the way that dangerous things were beautiful. Sharp, elegant, and utterly uncompromising. She was also, Corrin realized as she rose from her throne, staring at Liva with an expression of disbelief that was rapidly transforming into something much more powerful. "Liva," the queen whispered, her voice carrying across the enormous chamber with crystalline clarity. The little girl who had been silent for most of their journey across the galaxy suddenly let go of Corrin's hand and ran toward the throne with the unconscious certainty of a child who had never forgotten the way home. "Mother!" Liva called, her voice ringing through the chamber as Queen Seraphina stepped down from her throne and caught her daughter in arms that trembled with 7 years of grief finally finding resolution. Around them, the assembled court fell silent as their untouchable queen held her lost child and wept tears that glowed like captured starlight. "She's mine," Queen Seraphina said, her voice breaking with emotions that Corrin suspected hadn't been seen in this chamber for decades. "She's really mine." As mother and daughter embraced in the heart of an alien empire, Corrin stood forgotten in the crystalline light and realized that his life as a simple smuggler had just become infinitely more complicated. The silence in the throne room was broken by the sound of several courtiers fainting, which Corrin found oddly comforting. Apparently even advanced alien civilizations had people who dealt with shocking news by falling over dramatically. The queen's emotional display had created ripples of luminescent response throughout the assembled nobles, their skin patterns shifting through what he was beginning to recognize as the Netherian equivalent of excited whispering. "My lady," ventured an elderly courtier whose elaborate robe suggested high rank, "perhaps we should verify, that is to say, genetic confirmation might be advisable." Queen Seraphina's luminescence flared with an intensity that made several people step backward. "Lord Theron," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that could probably stop asteroid impacts through sheer willpower, "are you suggesting that I cannot recognize my own daughter?" "Of course not, Your Majesty," Lord Theron replied quickly, his skin patterns showing what Corrin interpreted as diplomatic panic. "I merely thought that protocols might require." "Protocols," the queen said, settling Liva more comfortably in her arms while fixing the courtier with a gaze that could have cut crystal, "did not prepare for the return of a child who was supposed to be dead. Nor did they account for the remarkable human who brought her home." It took Corrin a moment to realize that the queen was looking at him. "Oh," he said, suddenly aware that several hundred pairs of alien eyes were focused on him with varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and what might have been gratitude. "Your Majesty. I'm just Corrin. Corrin Ashworth. I found her in a refugee camp. Just Corin, the queen repeated, her luminescence shifting to patterns that he couldn't interpret but that seemed warmer than her previous display. You found my daughter in a refugee camp and brought her across half the galaxy to return her to me. She asked me to take her to the Light City, Corin said, feeling increasingly out of place in the crystalline grandeur of the throne room. I didn't know she was. I mean, I had no idea she was your daughter. She just seemed like a lost kid who needed help. A lost kid, Queen Seraphina said softly, looking down at Liva, who was studying the throne room with the kind of intense concentration that suggested she was remembering details from a different lifetime. Yes, I suppose that's exactly what she was. Mother, Liva said, her small voice carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect chamber, are you still angry about the garden incident? The queen's luminescence flickered with what Corin was learning to recognize as surprise. The garden incident. When I tried to make the crystals sing by hitting them with your ceremonial staff, Liva explained matter-of-factly. You said I was grounded until I learned proper respect for palace property. Liva, the queen said, her voice thick with emotions that ranged from joy to heartbreak, you were 4 years old. That was 7 years ago. Oh, Liva said, considering this information seriously. Am I still grounded? The sound that came from Queen Seraphina might have been laughter or sob, possibly both. No, my heart. You are definitely not still grounded. Good, Liva said, then looked around the throne room with renewed interest. Can I see my room? I want to check if my crystal collection is still there. Of course, the queen said, though Corin noticed that her hands were shaking slightly as she held her daughter. But first, we need to talk to the man who brought you home. Corin Ashworth, she said, turning her attention back to him with an intensity that made him wish he'd worn better clothes, you have given me back something I thought was lost forever. How do I possibly thank you for that? You don't need to thank me, Corin said, though he was beginning to understand that refusing thanks from galactic royalty might be more complicated than accepting them. I just did what anyone would do. No, the queen said firmly, you did what a good person would do. There is a significant difference. Before Corin could respond, Lord Theron cleared his throat with the kind of diplomatic cough that suggested urgent political considerations. Your Majesty, if I may, the princess's return will have significant implications for succession law, noble house alignments, and the various treaties that were negotiated assuming no royal heir. Lord Theron, the queen said without looking away from Corin, those implications can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, I intend to have dinner with my daughter and the man who brought her home. But Your Majesty, the Council of Lords will expect immediate consultation. The Council of Lords, Queen Seraphina said, her luminescence shifting to patterns that made even Corin recognize the threat, will expect whatever I tell them to expect. My daughter has been missing for 7 years. Political consultations can wait 24 hours. Yes, Your Majesty, Lord Theron said, though his skin pattern suggested he was already calculating the political chaos that would result from delaying formal announcements. Corin, the Queen said, her voice carrying an invitation that sounded more like a royal command, I hope you'll join us for dinner. I'm sure Liva has stories to tell, and I confess I'm curious about the circumstances that led to this remarkable reunion. I don't really have proper clothes for dining with royalty, Corin said, looking down at his travel-stained smuggler's outfit. Then we'll provide them, the Queen said simply. Though I suspect that anyone brave enough to bring a lost princess home to her mother is not someone who needs to worry about impressing people with clothing. As the royal entourage began moving toward what Corin assumed were private quarters, he found himself walking beside the most powerful woman in Etherian space while carrying on a conversation that felt surreal in its normalcy. Where did you find her? The Queen asked, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. Refugee camp on Kalen, 7, Corin said. She was living with a group of war orphans, surviving on food distribution and whatever they could scavenge. She'd been there for at least 2 years, maybe longer. 2 years, the Queen repeated, her luminescence dimming with what looked like pain. What was she doing before that? I don't know, Corin admitted. She doesn't talk much about her experiences. But she's got the survival instincts of someone who's been taking care of herself for a long time. Taking care of herself at age 7, the Queen said, and there was something in her voice that suggested heads would roll when she found out how her daughter had ended up alone in a refugee camp. She's remarkable, Corin said, watching as Liva examined everything they passed with the intense curiosity of someone revisiting a half-remembered dream. Smart, brave, incredibly resilient. And she never stopped believing she could find her way home. Home, the Queen said softly. I had given up hope that she would ever come home. Well, Corin said, surprised by his own boldness in offering comfort to galactic royalty, she did. And now you have a chance to make up for lost time. Queen Seraphina looked at him with an expression that combined gratitude with something that might have been respect. Corin Ashworth, you are either very wise or very naive. Probably both, Corin said, then paused as a thought occurred to him. Your Majesty, what happens now? I mean, I brought her home, she's safe with you, so I should probably get out of your way and let you deal with the family reunion. Get out of our way, the Queen asked, her luminescence shifting to patterns that seemed almost amused. Corin, you have just restored the royal heir to the Netherian Empire. You are not going anywhere until we determine exactly how this miracle occurred, and until we ensure that you are properly rewarded for your service to the crown. I don't need a reward, Corin said. Seeing her safe with her mother is reward enough. Spoken like someone who has never dealt with royal gratitude, the Queen said, and this time her luminescence definitely showed amusement. You saved my daughter's life and brought her home. The debt I owe you cannot be dismissed simply because you're too modest to claim it. As they reached the private royal quarters, Corin found himself thinking that his simple act of kindness toward a lost child had somehow entangled him in galactic politics in ways he was only beginning to understand. But as he watched Liva explore her childhood home with growing excitement, and saw the joy transforming Queen Seraphina's previously stern features, he decided that some complications were worth embracing. After all, how often did a small-time smuggler get the chance to have dinner with royalty and help reunite a family that had been torn apart by tragedy? The answer, he reflected as servants began preparing what appeared to be a feast fit for returning princesses, was apparently exactly once, and he intended to make the most of it. Dinner with the Queen of Nethys Prime turned out to be both more intimate and more politically explosive than Corin had anticipated. The private dining chamber was still crystalline and magnificent, but smaller and warmer than the throne room, with bioluminescent panels that responded to the emotional states of those present. Currently, they were glowing with the soft blues and golds that Corin was learning meant contentment and joy. Tell me about the camp, Queen Seraphina said, cutting Liva's food into manageable pieces with the automatic precision of someone remembering how to be a mother. What was life like there? Busy, Liva said, accepting the help without complaint despite having fed herself for years. Everyone had jobs. Mine was watching for the bad ships and helping with the little ones who couldn't stop crying. Bad ships? The Queen asked, her luminescence flickering with concern. The ones that took people away, Liva explained matter-of-factly. Slavers, mostly. Sometimes just mean people who wanted to hurt refugees for fun. I was good at hiding, so I helped others hide too. Corin watched Queen Seraphina's expression shift from maternal concern to something much more dangerous. The bioluminescent panels around the room responded to her emotional state, their warm glow shifting toward the cooler blues and silvers that he was beginning to associate with royal anger. Slavers, the Queen said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet fury that probably made entire star systems reconsider their foreign policy decisions. Operating in refugee camps. It happens, Corin said, trying to ease the tension. Border conflicts create displaced populations, and displaced populations are vulnerable to exploitation. The camp administrators do their best, but they're usually overwhelmed and under-resourced. And where exactly are the Galactic Protection Forces during these slaving operations? The Queen asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and didn't like it. Protecting people who can afford protection, Corin said bluntly. Refugees don't typically have political influence or economic leverage. Queen Seraphina set down her utensils with the careful precision of someone exercising extreme self-control. That, she said, is going to change. Mother, Liva said, apparently unconcerned by the political implications of her revelations, can I have dessert? Corin promised me real sweets when we got to the light city. Of course, my heart, the queen said, her luminescence warming again as she focused on her daughter. What kind of sweets would you like? The ones that taste like starlight, Liva said seriously. I remember them from when I was little. Crystallized nectar cakes, the queen said, her voice soft with memory. Your favorite when you were 4. I'm 11 now, Liva pointed out. But I still like them. The casual mention of her age created a moment of silence as both adults processed the implications. Liva had been 4 when she disappeared, and she was 11 now, 7 years of childhood spent surviving in conditions that most adults couldn't handle. Liva, Corin said carefully, do you remember anything about the day you got separated from your family? The little girl's luminescence dimmed, and she looked at her mother with an expression that was far too old for her face. There was an explosion, she said quietly. And fire. And people screaming. Someone grabbed me and put me in a pod and told me to be very quiet and very still. Who grabbed you? The queen asked, her maternal instincts clearly warring with her need for information. A guard, Liva said. She had the silver marks that meant she was supposed to protect me. She said the bad people were coming and I had to hide until the good people could find me. What happened to the guard? Corin asked. She went back to help the others, Liva said simply. I never saw her again. Queen Seraphina's luminescence had shifted to patterns that Corin didn't recognize but that looked ominous. The escape pod must have malfunctioned. Instead of returning to Nethys Prime, it took you to the outer territories. Where she spent 7 years learning to survive on her own, Corin added, watching as the queen processed this information with visible effort. Not completely on my own, Liva corrected. There were other kids who taught me things. And adults who shared food sometimes. And Corin, who brought me home. Yes, the queen said, looking at Corin with an expression that mixed gratitude with something more complex, Corin, who brought you home. Which reminds me. We haven't discussed how exactly a human smuggler happened to be in a refugee camp on the Outer Rim. Corin felt heat rise in his cheeks. I was delivering medical supplies. Unofficially. Unofficially. The official supply shipments kept getting hijacked or delayed by bureaucratic complications, he explained. So some of the aid organizations started hiring independent contractors to ensure delivery. Smugglers, the queen said, though there was no judgment in her voice. Smugglers with consciences, Corin corrected. We figure that keeping people alive is more important than strictly following shipping regulations. An admirable philosophy, the queen said, and her luminescence suggested genuine approval. Though it raises interesting questions about why civilian contractors are more effective at humanitarian aid than official government programs. Because we don't have to file reports explaining why helping people is more important than following protocol, Corin said, then immediately worried that he might have just insulted the governmental systems of a galactic empire. But Queen Seraphina was smiling, actually smiling, with an expression that transformed her austere features into something warm and almost approachable. Corin Ashworth, you have a refreshingly direct perspective on bureaucratic inefficiency. Your Majesty, came a voice from the chamber's entrance, I apologize for the interruption, but Lord Commander Vexthane reports urgent security concerns that require your immediate attention. The Queen's expression shifted back to royal authority mode so quickly that Corin wondered if he'd imagined the previous warmth. What kind of security concerns? Intelligence reports suggest that certain noble houses are adjusting their political positions in response to the princess's return, the guard said carefully. Lord Commander Vexthane recommends increased security protocols and immediate discussion of succession implications. Political adjustments, the Queen said, her luminescence shifting to patterns that made the room's ambient lighting take on distinctly threatening overtones. How diplomatic. And how predictable. What does that mean? Corin asked, though he was beginning to suspect that bringing Liva home had created complications beyond family reunions. It means, the Queen said, standing with fluid grace, that some people had made plans based on the assumption that I would never have an heir. Liva's return makes those plans problematic. How problematic? Corin asked. The kind of problematic that usually involves assassination attempts, Queen Seraphina said matter-of-factly. Liva, sweetheart, you're going to stay here with a very nice guard detail while Mother handles some business. Corin, I'm afraid your visit to our peaceful royal court is about to become more interesting than you probably bargained for. More interesting how? Well, the Queen said, her luminescence now showing patterns that could only be described as predatory. If someone is planning to eliminate my daughter to preserve their political ambitions, they'll probably want to eliminate the witnesses to her rescue as well. Witnesses meaning me, Corin said. Witnesses meaning you, the Queen confirmed. Which means you're now under royal protection whether you want it or not. And if I want to leave? Then you'll be under royal protection while traveling, she said with a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring but came across as slightly terrifying. Corin, you saved my daughter's life. I'm not going to let anyone end yours as a reward for that service. As guards began implementing what were apparently emergency security protocols, Corin found himself thinking that his simple humanitarian mission had somehow evolved into a political thriller with very real consequences. But as he watched Liva calmly finishing her dinner despite the chaos around her, he realized that some complications were worth the risk. After all, he'd brought a lost princess home to her mother. If that resulted in a few political complications and the occasional assassination attempt, well, at least it would make for interesting stories later. Assuming, of course, that he lived long enough to tell them. The assassination attempt came at dawn, which Corin found oddly considerate. At least the conspirators had let them finish dinner and get a decent night's sleep before trying to kill them. He woke to the sound of energy weapons discharging in the corridors outside his guest quarters, followed by the distinctive hum of defensive shields activating throughout the palace. Sir, came a voice through his door's communication system, this is Captain Zara Thyl, Royal Guard. Please remain in your quarters while we deal with a security situation. How bad is the security situation? Corin called back, pulling on the clothes that palace servants had provided, which were considerably nicer than anything he'd ever owned, though he suspected they might soon be decorated with blast marks. The kind that involves explosives, insurgents, and people who clearly didn't think their plan through very carefully, Captain Zara Thyl replied. Her Majesty requests that you keep Princess Liva safe while she handles the immediate threat. Princess Liva is in my quarters? Corin asked, then looked around the room to find the girl sitting calmly on his bed, fully dressed and holding what appeared to be a palace guard sidearm with disturbing competence. Hello, Corin, Liva said cheerfully. Mother thought I'd be safer with you than in my own room. She was right. Someone just tried to break in there with what she called, crude but effective explosives. And they gave you a weapon? Corin asked, staring at the energy pistol in the hands of an 11-year-old. I took it from the guard who was supposed to kidnap me, Liva explained matter-of-factly. He seemed surprised that refugee children learned to fight back. I was not surprised that palace conspirators are terrible at actual violence. Corin looked at the unconscious guard lying in the corner of his room, whom he'd somehow failed to notice in his initial assessment of the situation. Is he dead? Stunned, Liva said. I'm not allowed to kill people unless Mother gives permission. Palace rules. Palace rules, Corin repeated weakly, wondering what kind of royal childhood included protocols for when murder was and wasn't acceptable. The kind of rules, came Queen Seraphina's voice from the doorway, that become necessary when your daughter spends 7 years learning survival skills in refugee camps. She entered the room with the fluid grace of someone who had just finished dealing with violent insurgents and found the experience mildly annoying rather than threatening. Your Majesty, Corrin said, noting that the Queen's ceremonial robes had been replaced by what appeared to be combat armor that still managed to look elegant. I'm guessing the security situation has been resolved. Comprehensively, Queen Seraphina said, her luminescence showing the satisfied patterns of someone who had just reminded her enemies why challenging royal authority was traditionally a fatal mistake. Lord Theron and his co-conspirators discovered that planning a coup is significantly easier than executing one, particularly when the target of your assassination plot has been anticipating your move for several years. Several years? Corrin asked. Political conspiracies rarely develop overnight, the Queen explained, moving to check on Liva, who seemed completely unfazed by having disabled an armed kidnapper. I've been tracking the noble houses that positioned themselves to benefit from my lack of an heir. Liva's return simply forced them to accelerate their timeline. And now? Now they're dead, exiled, or imprisoned, depending on their level of involvement and their willingness to cooperate with the investigation, the Queen said with the casual tone of someone discussing dinner plans rather than mass political purges. The Netherian Empire does not treat threats to the royal family with leniency. Mother, Liva said, setting down the energy pistol with careful precision, did you remember to question them about the original attack? The one where I got lost? Queen Seraphina's luminescence shifted to patterns that Corrin recognized as maternal pride mixed with something much more dangerous. An excellent question, my heart. Yes, Lord Theron was very forthcoming about his involvement in the transport sabotage 7 years ago. He was behind your kidnapping? Corrin asked, looking at Liva with new appreciation for her calm competence. He orchestrated the attack that was supposed to kill me, Liva corrected. The kidnapping was an accident. The escape pod was supposed to be destroyed with everyone else on the transport. But your guard saved you, the Queen said, her voice soft with grief and gratitude. Captain Velsia sacrificed her life to get you to safety, even though safety wasn't where either of you ended up. I want to visit her memorial, Liva said quietly. To thank her for giving me 7 years of life, even if they weren't the 7 years anyone planned. We'll arrange that, the Queen promised, then turned to Corrin with an expression that mixed royal authority with personal gratitude. Which brings us to the question of your future, Corrin Ashworth. You've helped expose a conspiracy that has been threatening the stability of the Netherian Empire for 7 years. You've returned the royal heir safely to her throne. And you've proven that sometimes the most important diplomatic missions are carried out by people who aren't diplomats. I just brought a lost kid home, Corrin said, though he was beginning to understand that his definition of simple and the Queen's were very different. You brought my daughter home, Queen Seraphina corrected. And in doing so, you've earned a debt that I cannot repay with simple gratitude. Your Majesty, I don't need, Corrin, the Queen interrupted, her luminescence shifting to patterns that suggested she was about to make a pronouncement that would change his life whether he wanted it changed or not. I am offering you a position as Special Advisor for Humanitarian Affairs. Your job would be to identify and address the kinds of situations that create refugee populations like the one where you found Liva. You want me to become a diplomat? Corrin asked, trying to imagine himself in formal negotiations rather than smuggling medical supplies past military blockades. I want you to become someone who can prevent other children from spending 7 years lost and alone because political systems failed them, the Queen said. Someone who understands that helping people is more important than following protocols. Corrin looked at Liva, who was watching the conversation with the intense attention of someone whose life had been shaped by the consequences of political decisions. What would that involve exactly? Establishing refugee protection protocols throughout Netherian space, the Queen said. Coordinating with aid organizations, official and unofficial. Ensuring that humanitarian supplies reach the people who need them without bureaucratic interference. And probably getting shot at by people who profit from refugee exploitation, Corrin added. Almost certainly, the Queen agreed. Though you'd have royal protection and resources that independent smugglers don't typically enjoy. Plus, Liva added helpfully, you'd get to stay here and have dinner with us sometimes. I like having you around, Corrin. You're good at making Mother smile. Corin looked at Queen Seraphina, noting that her luminescence was indeed showing patterns that seemed warmer when she looked at him. I make you smile. You have a talent for cutting through political complexity to focus on what actually matters, the Queen said, her luminescence brightening in ways that had nothing to do with royal authority and everything to do with personal affection. It's refreshing. And attractive. Attractive? Corin repeated, feeling the universe shift around him again. Corin, the Queen said, stepping closer with the kind of graceful movement that made him wonder if royal genetics included enhanced coordination. In the past 24 hours, you've reunited me with my daughter, helped expose a conspiracy that threatened the empire, and proved that you're willing to risk your life to protect people you care about. If you think I haven't noticed that you're also intelligent, brave, and remarkably kind, then you haven't been paying attention. Mother likes you, Liva translated helpfully. She's been asking the servants about human courtship customs. Liva, the Queen said, her luminescence flickering with what Corin was learning to recognize as royal embarrassment. What? Liva asked innocently. It's true. Captain Zara Thyl said you spent an hour yesterday asking about human gift-giving traditions and whether humans consider shared meals to be romantic gestures. Corin found himself grinning as he realized that the most powerful woman in Netherian space had been trying to figure out how to court a human smuggler. For the record, he said, shared meals can definitely be romantic gestures. Especially when they involve crystallized nectar cakes and conversations about political reform. Good to know, the Queen said, her luminescence settling into patterns that seemed both regal and surprisingly shy. So will you accept the position? And perhaps explore the possibility of more shared meals in the future. Corin looked around the crystalline chamber where he'd spent the night, at the palace that had become a temporary home, at the little girl who had trusted him to bring her safely across the galaxy, and at the remarkable woman who ruled an empire and wanted to court a former smuggler. Your Majesty, he said, surprising himself with his certainty, I accept. Both the position and the dinner invitations. Excellent, Queen Seraphina said, her luminescence brightening with what could only be described as joy. Though you should probably start calling me Seraphina when we're in private. Your Majesty becomes awkward during romantic conversations. Seraphina, Corin said, testing the name and finding it felt right on his tongue. I like it. Good, she said, stepping close enough that he could see the complex patterns of light that played across her skin when she was happy. Because I have a feeling we're going to have many opportunities to practice using it. 6 months later, Corin stood in the newly established Refugee Protection Agency headquarters, reviewing reports from aid stations throughout Netherian space. The work was challenging, often dangerous, and infinitely more rewarding than anything he'd accomplished as an independent smuggler. Through his office window, he could see the palace gardens where Liva was teaching a group of young refugees how to cultivate the crystal flowers that had been her childhood favorites. Corin, Seraphina said, entering his office with the kind of smile that still made his heart skip beats, how are the new protection protocols working? Better than expected, he said, gesturing to the reports that showed significant improvements in refugee safety and resource distribution. Though we're still fighting bureaucratic resistance from some of the outer territories. Resistance that will disappear when they realize that protecting refugees is now official imperial policy, Seraphina said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Speaking of policy, I have a proposal for you. Professional or personal? Corin asked, though her luminescence patterns suggested the answer. Both, she said, her skin showing the warm golds and blues that he'd learned meant contentment and affection. The Council of Lords has approved the establishment of a permanent humanitarian affairs ministry. They've also approved my recommendation for who should head that ministry. I assume that recommendation comes with increased responsibilities and probably more people trying to shoot me, Corin said. Almost certainly, Seraphina agreed. But it also comes with a ministerial residence, a permanent place in the imperial court, and formal recognition of your status as an essential advisor to the crown. And the personal proposal? Seraphina's luminescence shifted to patterns that seemed almost nervous. The personal proposal is that you might consider making those arrangements permanent. In all respects. Corin felt his heart stop for a moment as he processed the implications. Serafina, are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking you to become my partner in every sense that matters, she said, her luminescence brightening with hope and vulnerability. Professional, personal, and political. I'm asking you to help me build an empire that protects people like Liva instead of failing them. And to be Liva's father, Corin said, understanding the full scope of what she was offering. She already considers you family, Serafina said softly. She told me yesterday that she hopes you'll stay forever, because you're the one who brought her home and made our family complete. Corin looked out the window at Liva, who was laughing as she helped refugee children plant crystal seeds in the palace gardens. The little girl who had trusted him to take her somewhere safe had given him a home, a purpose, and a love he'd never thought possible. Serafina, he said, reaching across the desk to take her luminescent hand in his, I accept. All of it. The ministry, the partnership, the family, and whatever other impossible adventures you have planned. Good, she said, her luminescence creating patterns of light that seemed to dance with joy. Because I was hoping you'd say that. Liva has already started planning the ceremony, and I'm told human Etherian weddings require extensive coordination. Extensive coordination? Corin asked. Apparently, Serafina said with a smile that promised years of happiness ahead, we need to blend traditions from two different species, satisfy the protocol requirements of an imperial wedding, and make sure the ceremony includes crystallized nectar cakes for the flower girl. Sounds perfect, Corin said, pulling her close enough to see the complex patterns of love and contentment that played across her skin. After all, the best adventures always start with impossible circumstances. True, Serafina agreed, as palace bells began ringing to announce their engagement to the Empire. And this one started with a lost child, a simple act of kindness, and a smuggler who proved that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that bring families home.